Welcome everyone to our first virtual public town hall today. I am Allison Gingold. I'm the chair of the Jewish Public Affairs Committee of California, and I'm proudly serving the California Jewish community. For the past 50 years, JPAC has been part of the thread of California. And if you are new to our organization and our workings, we are the largest single state coalition of Jewish organizations in the nation. Our member organizations collectively serve hundreds of thousands of Californians of all backgrounds and represent the interests of California's 1.2 million Jews. We use our community's collective reach and strength to help build the world that we want to live in for ourselves and for all vulnerable people across California. In recent years, JPAC's influence has been realized in unprecedented ways. Since 2019, we have successfully advocated for hundreds of millions of dollars from the state budget for a wide variety and a wide range of community projects, including enhancing community security initiatives, rebuilding Jewish summer camps destroyed in wildfires, expanding our Holocaust education institutions, and securing vital resources for seniors, immigrants, and people experiencing food insecurity. We also helped pass crucial legislation to create and expand mental health, anti-poverty, and hate crime initiatives. I'm happy you can join us today. Me, David Bocarsly, our executive director, Cliff Berg, our lobbyist, and Sarah Adivi, our program manager. For me and for all of us, welcome to hear about our informative update on the legislative process and our work ahead. Sarah.
Sorry about that. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're very excited. So our executive director, David Bocarsly, and our lobbyist, Cliff Berg, are joining us. And I'm so sorry, let me just fix this. Okay, I'm so sorry, everyone. All right, so today we are doing a brief town hall meeting. Cliff and David are here to discuss with us and explain and take questions on the bill and budget process, JPAC's involvement in the process, our budget victories, and the work ahead in our priority legislation. Please feel free to use the Q&A function on Zoom to ask questions during the presentation. I'll be collecting the questions and will facilitate a Q&A after. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce David and Cliff.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And hi, everyone. It's so good to see you. This is exciting for us. We haven't done something like this before, and our team was chatting as we were reviewing the final budget and realized that there's a lot that goes on in getting us to this place. Starting back in the fall of last year, working with our member organizations, working with legislators, and through Advocacy Day and a lot of meetings and efforts over the course of the year. It takes a ton of work to get from the beginning of the year to a final budget. And it takes a ton of work on our end to get from early stages of advocacy to this year's really successful budget results. And we realized that we, who are deeply involved in this process, wanted to be able to explain to folks who might not be as involved how this happens. You might see, oh, we got a certain amount of money in the budget, and not really understand where we're involved and how this happens and where kind of the levers are pulled and all of those things. And so this is an opportunity for us to share and seeing how much interest we have in this town hall. It seems like this is something you're all willing to and interested in learning about. So we're grateful you're joining us. And we're excited to be able to give a little bit of a pullback of the curtains and take questions, and know that we are regularly available to answer further questions that might not be answered today. But we'll start with Cliff, my amazing partner in crime, who's been doing this work for decades now. He's been with JPAC for, I think, 25 years. So he deeply understands the Jewish community and Jewish community advocacy. And we'll have him take us through a little bit of a budget 101, explaining exactly how the process works from a legislative standpoint. How do we get from January to a final budget in June? And where do organizations kind of plug in? Who are the key stakeholders in the legislature? So I'll pass it over to Cliff to start, and then I'll bring it back to me to talk about JPAC's specific role. But Cliff, if you can give us an overview, tell us what's happening when the budget process is enacted.
Thanks. Hey, David. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. And I want to thank David and Sarah and Allison for working as our JPAC team to make this happen. Exciting new idea to do this kind of webinar. I've been asked to sort of give you all sort of an overview of the California state budget process, generally speaking, before we drill down on some of the JPAC specifics. So I'm going to start off by actually talking about the state budget process in comparison to the federal budget process. And the point that I wanted to make in doing that is the federal budget process revolves around one essential fact that we don't have in California, which is, they don't have to have a balanced budget at the federal level. And I'm sure all of you have read in the newspapers over the years about how Congress is fighting over extending the deficit ceiling so that they can just print more money. So sometimes I wish I was a lobbyist at the federal level looking for budget items in a system in which you could just print money and you didn't have to have a state balanced budget. I would not hear as often as I did this year, hey, Cliff, well, we don't have as much money this year and things are going to be tighter and we have a GAN limit and therefore, we can't print money. So, that is the huge difference between the federal system and the state system. The governor is required to propose, in essence, a balanced budget to the state legislature. So critical fact about the state budget process, from which flows decades of various JPAC positions on the budget, because the state budget has historically gone from boom to bust. And we have seen billion-dollar surpluses and we have seen billion-dollar deficits from year to year. In fact, many people will say the reason Gray Davis was recalled, in addition to the energy crisis, was the fact that in January of his last year of governorship, he had a $20 billion surplus, and by the May revise, he had a $12 billion deficit, which presents JPAC with a very different budget strategy if we're in a year of cutting programs versus a year of looking for new money. And JPAC has experienced both in the last decade. The California state budget is extremely dependent upon a progressive tax system in the state of California, in which high wage earners and primarily capital gains make the difference between a budget surplus or a budget deficit. And because the economy can be so fluid and change so quickly, it has an immediate impact upon the California state budget. When Gray was the governor, we had what we called the dot-com bubble. Then we had the dot-com bubble burst. And that resulted in this huge swing in billions of dollars. Well, this last year, we've been very fortunate. We had a significant budget surplus, but we don't know how long that will last. We never do, and we already have heard comments about a potential national or worldwide recession and its impact on California. So California operates on a fiscal year. The fiscal year starts July 1st and runs from July 1 to June 30th of the following year. The state constitution requires the governor to propose a balanced state budget to the legislature on the 10th day of January of the calendar year for the next fiscal year. So this, in essence, is what kicks off the whole budget cycle and discussion. But the real work on the budget starts much earlier. When the governor proposes that budget in January, it's really based upon work done by the State Department of Finance in November and December of the previous calendar year. in which the Department of Finance is in essence asking every state agency what their budget was last year, what their projection is for next year, and matching up the existing, what we call the base budget for the state of California, with then economic projections from like the UCLA School of Finance and other forecasters to determine what they believe the state of the economy and therefore the state of revenues will be for the upcoming fiscal year. So all this is happening in like November and December of the current fiscal year. The governor comes out in January of the current fiscal year and says, I'm proposing a budget that's going to run from July 1, the next fiscal year, but 6 months from then in the calendar year, which can create, by the way, an interesting anomaly in an election year when we have, for example, Jerry Brown was still governor because the new governor isn't sworn in until the end of January, but Jerry is in essence presenting the budget in January. Same thing happened with Arnold. So the new governor then has to scramble to put their imprint upon his own budget, which is prepared by his predecessor. So after the governor proposes his budget in January, in essence, the legislature takes that budget starting early March and hears it in budget subcommittees in both houses, duplicating the process, Senate and Assembly, and they consider every item in the state budget, item by item, and go through it in those subcommittee hearings between March and May. Generally speaking, they do not take any action on anything that is at all controversial in those subcommittee hearings, and they push everything off until May, because in May, we have what's called the May Revise. The May Revise comes out mid-May, and in essence, it's a recalculation of the governor's budget. So what is the budget of California? And we talk about, gee, the budget has to be balanced. Well, at point in time, the budget calculation is really based upon outgoing expenditures and incoming revenues. When you present, the governor presents in January, he's basing that upon estimates of income tax returns that are going to come in April, corporate tax, sales tax, all the various revenues, fuel tax, and then various expenditures, whether it's caseload for Medi-Cal, welfare. So these are all like, frozen moments in time throughout that process. And until May, when they have opened the income tax returns, have a better handle for what the revenues have been on sales tax, corporate tax, and the other taxes. And then the legislature goes into full negotiation mode. And this year, it was in essence the Democratic leadership of both houses negotiating what they call a legislative budget. And they are subject to getting that budget to the governor by June 15th. If they don't get it to the governor by June 15th, then they lose their pay until a budget is passed. So you have the legislature passing a state budget by June 15th. But the process has evolved over the last decade. Two significant things that have changed in California. One is the voters approved the ballot proposition that I mentioned, which says you have to pass the budget by June 15th or you lose your pay. But they also included reducing the vote requirement on the state budget from a 2/3 majority to a simple majority, which was very meaningful at the time they did it. Slightly less so now that we have Democratic supermajorities at the current time in both houses, but still, it basically means that you can pass a budget. The Democratic leadership in both houses can pass a budget without Republicans, makes Republicans irrelevant. Passing the budget also is in essence a leadership vote, and all members of the caucus are required to vote with the leadership on the budget. It's considered a major test of your commitment to the leadership. So, one of the main impacts, we say the state budget has to be passed by June 15th, but we know there wasn't a budget deal this year or around June 27th. So what does all that mean, and how has these reforms and changes impacted the legislature? Well, the notion that legislators won't get paid if they don't pass a budget, first year out, the state controller took them to court and refused to pay them, saying they didn't pass a budget on time. Well, the legislature said we did. We passed a budget bill. Controller said it wasn't a balanced budget. It wasn't a budget the governor signed. Legislature said, too bad. We passed the budget. We get paid. Went to court. Court ruled with the legislature and said it's up to the legislature to determine, separate branch of government, up to the legislature to determine what is the budget. So that became a discussion about what is the budget. And what has evolved out of that has been a series of bills and a process by which the legislature passes a bill they say is the budget. The budget, however, has not been negotiated with the governor, and there's huge items outstanding. So then they go into negotiations, but they get paid, and they wind up with a series of what we call budget junior bills, a series of what we call trailer bills. I think this year there was like nearly 24 trailer bills. When the voters approved the ballot initiatives making these changes, they were trying to address, I think, the problem that many of you are familiar with that we had in years, and many of you may not be, but for years and years, for the decades prior, we had what we call budget impasses in Sacramento. And in the budget impasse, you had a two-thirds majority vote requirement. You didn't have two-thirds Democratic majorities, and small minorities of legislators could hold up the state budget, refuse to vote for it until they got a pool in their district, or they got XYZ, or in the case of Abel Maldonado, we got a top two voting system, which you may not be aware, but the reason we have a top two voting system in California versus a D versus R voting system is because Maldonado wouldn't provide a vote on the budget until he got what he perceived to be election reform. So legislators' leadership got tired of being held hostage by minorities in the legislature, so they came up with a ballot proposition that would wipe out the two-thirds majority requirement so that would not happen. But they also gave the voters the, hey, we won't get paid if we don't pass the budget on time. But what we didn't know was that the definition of a budget would change radically, and passing the D bill that the legislature deems the budget bill would satisfy that requirement. One of the major other probably unintentional repercussions of this budget reform was creating a much more opaque budget system. So as JPAC for many, many years, and not all that in the far distant future, but fairly recently, when we had a budget request that we were sponsoring, let's take the nonprofit security grant, the first year, we would go find a member. That year was Senator Ben Allen of Los Angeles. He'd write a letter to the budget committee, want to get a match of federal dollars for nonprofit security grants. That letter would go to the committee. It would be sent to the subcommittee. The subcommittee would schedule that item for subcommittee hearing. He would present, I would testify, and the committee would either vote upon it, subcommittee would either vote upon it or take it under consideration and vote on it after the May revise. So for many, many years in the California legislative budget process, items that we now call member requests and caucus requests all went into a public process in which they were agendized, they were heard in subcommittee, they were voted on at some point, and then the two houses would have their own versions of the budget. And after they each adopted their version of the budget, it would go to budget conference committee. And it would be, those items would be reconciled in budget conference committee in public, in a public discussion, and a public vote. Now, the process was always back room in the sense that before they went into public, they would have meetings and discuss each of the items, and the Democrats would come up with, this is what we're going to do in conference committee, but it was all done in public. So now, I think as a result of, hey, we passed this sort of budget bill to satisfy the we're going to get paid requirement, then we're going to go off and actually negotiate behind the scenes. And because we don't need the Republicans in the process at all, everything has become much more backroom than it ever was. And decisions are not transparent and actions are not transparent. So the process this year that we saw, for example, was they cut this deal on the budget. And the big issue in the state budget this year, as I'm sure you all know, was the governor's proposal for economic relief for California motorists, and whether it was going to be done through checks sent to people based on the number of cars they had per car through the DMV, or whether it was going to be based on income through the FTB. was a big issue that hung up for budget for weeks. So when they finally reached an agreement on that, and then the other dominoes fell into place, suddenly Sunday, all these budget bills and trailer bills start appearing in print. They're then heard in Monday in committee and budget committees in both houses. They're voted out. No amendments are allowed because it's a leadership decision. Goes to the floor, have to be in print for 72 hours, taken up Wednesday night, passed, and we're done. Budget's done. In that process, suddenly we see a number of requests that a number of JPAC member organizations, as well as thousands or hundreds of other organizations who requested appear in print in a budget bill, never heard in public till that hearing Monday. No discussion, no negotiation, certainly not on the part of the stakeholders, everything done behind the scenes. So the challenge as the process has moved more and more, and I will say this, it's not just the legislative budget process, but the legislative bill process, and we'll talk about that a little later, has also become much more less public, less transparent, and much more decisions made behind the scenes, which makes the challenge for us as JPAC all the more difficult and all the more work, because it's never really clear in negotiating this budget process today where the point of decision will be made and who is making it, which means that as I work for you and the JPAC member organizations with David on strategizing and how we have to lobby, more and more has moved away from the notion of like, gee, go testify at a public hearing with Ben Allen and say, we need nonprofit security grants. And more is you got to touch base. First, you have to line up advocates, champions for each project, each budget item, each issue, which may be individual members. It may be our close working partners with the Jewish caucus. It may be both, and usually it requires both. And then you have to sort of lobby, gee, the subcommittee chairs, the subcommittee members, the subcommittee staff, the budget committee chair, the budget staff. Then you have to lobby the leadership offices. Then you have to touch base with, and you go through the list of everybody who may impact the decision, because nobody tells you, well, this is going to be decided on June 27th by the subcommittee chair or by a vote of subcommittee.
To your point, though, I mean, first of all, this is incredible context, but while a lot of this has become opaque to process-wise, from year to year to year, we've figured out a lot of the touch points, right? A lot of the pressure points and where we can get involved. So, right, I mean, that's what you do, and that's your expertise, and so
that's what we do. Yeah, as Sacramento professionals who are like their day to day, right? Very opaque. If you're sitting in Los Angeles, I would say, and you're not talking to all these people all the time. And the story changed. No,
sorry, do you mind if I jump in and share a little bit about it's a part of why we wanted to do this forum is specifically exactly for the reasons that you touched on, right? That the average person in the public might think this is opaque to them, and it's opaque to us too, as people who have worked in the building, myself for many years, and who have been in lobbying for many years, as you have been. So while what's happening behind closed doors might be opaque, but what we do want to share and spend some time talking about today is really diving into how we plug in and how we choose to kind of leverage our relationships and our experience to try to overcome some of what we don't see behind closed doors, and try to be able to build as much power to be able to get our issues met. So
David, you want to talk a little bit about the JPAC process and
sure.
How we went about that?
Yeah. So first of all, I want to say thank you. I love doing this because even every time you talk, Cliff, I learned something from you about history and how we got to where we are today. So thank you for that really thorough overview. So Cliff started jumping in, but I'll take a step back to kind of how we get involved in this process, and it starts all the way back in fall. As Cliff said, the budget process really ends near the end of June when the fiscal year ends, and even then it's not fully over because there are trailer bills, but we start this process 9 months prior in the fall. When we start, Cliff and I will start working with our member organizations to get a sense of what the community needs. And our goal in that process is to figure out all of the relevant asks that might be made that year, and also have an eye to the missing pieces. So once we have tangible budget requests that we've collected or we've helped introduce, which usually come about in the beginning parts of the year, January and February, we work with our impacted member organizations to secure a champion in the legislature. And as Cliff started talking about, having a champion is incredibly important to the successful of a budget request. That could be an individual senator, an individual assembly member, or a group like the Jewish Caucus, but they're the ones who can formally submit a budget request for consideration in a way that outside organizations can, but not in as clear of a way, and not with as much legitimacy. So it's really helpful for us to secure as many champions for our requests as possible. Once budget items have been submitted by the legislators, which typically happens around the end of March or early April, we have extensive conversations amongst the JPAC board to finalize our priority list. And we put together our agenda for the year, basically, on budget items. We'll work with member organizations to build support in the legislature and in the community after that. So while legislators can champion only a limited number of budget items, which is why it's important to get to them early, every legislator can usually only introduce 3 or 4 budget items. They can also sign on to as many budget items as they want. So if, as Cliff mentioned, if Senator Ben Allen is introducing a budget item, we can then go to all the other legislators in the Jewish Caucus and beyond and say, well, you sign on in support of this item. And that doesn't count kind of against them, but we're able to build a coalition in that way. We also will then start getting letters of support from other community organizations, from local elected officials, and from influential activists to try to build out this base of support in the community. And once we've built that coalition, we can start working two lanes: the governor's office and the legislature's budget committees. And we do this very tangibly by writing letters of support of our own to all of the key stakeholders and setting up tons of meetings with relevant legislators and leaders in the governor's office. And Cliff does this exceptionally. He brings in JPAC and our impacted member organizations, and we're talking with anybody and everybody who will listen to let them know about why this is so important. So as Cliff mentioned, there are a few main points where we can get our items included in the budget. The first is the governor makes a budget proposal in May called the May Revise, where he might input some of our budget requests into the budget. The second is that the legislature then produces a counter proposal in early June to the governor's May proposal. So we might see some of our items put in there based on our lobbying efforts with the legislature. The third way we can have our budget items included in the budget is in final negotiations between the governor and the legislative leadership. We just saw the final budget, introduced a couple of weeks ago, and that had new items that we hadn't seen in either the May Revise or the legislature's counter proposal. Or 4, we can see items included in what Cliff talked about briefly is the trailer bills or the budget bill juniors, which are budget items that come out after the final budget is enacted that amend the budget. So there are a bunch of different avenues where we can get them into the process. And generally from historical standpoint, our budget items are those that are specific projects that once they are included in the budget by the governor or by the legislature, it's very rare that they would be taken out, because items that are taken out are usually those that are victim of negotiation. It's certainly possible. We never take anything for granted, but if the governor puts it in the May Revise, we are highly confident that we'll end up in the final budget. I'll also just add that we specifically set up our advocacy day to happen right before the governor announces his May Revise and during the heart of the legislature's budget committee hearings, so that we can make our strongest push at the most consequential moment in the process. And while we pick a few key priority items to talk about at advocacy day, more importantly, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're power building during that day. When we show up with over 200 engaged community members to the Capitol, we're sending a message to legislators that they should pay attention to what we're asking for. So while we'll focus on a few strategic items that day, we're also building momentum for all of our asks. And when advocacy day is over, we continue to advocate for our budget items at each step in the budget process by writing more budget support letters and setting up tons of meetings. And in each of those touch points, we point to the power of our community that they saw back in Sacramento in early May. So that's our involvement. And I know we're at the point where I'd like to open up some questions for Q&A in a couple of minutes, but I want to quickly go over what our items were for this year, just to highlight them. And I'll be quick about this because this is the stuff that we've shared with you in email, so you probably have seen some of this, but I just want to mention them because I'm really proud of the work that we've been able to do this year. Despite the challenges that Cliff outlined, we've been able to build an understanding of where and how to build power, and have been more and more successful with each impending year. And this year, we've been able to secure more money from the budget than ever before. So this year we supported 11 items, budget request items this year in the state budget. 9 of those items I would classify as items that are really driven solely by JPAC and our impacted member organizations. That means that the organizations that are going to receive direct funding from this are the ones who really brought it to us, and together we work to strategize how to get those in the budget items. But each year we also advocate for a couple of budget items that would impact our community and our member organizations, but are also driven by other non-Jewish coalitions. So we had 2 items in our budget request this year that fall under that category. The first is funding to extend the amount of support that refugees and asylum seekers receive from 3 months of care to a full year. And the second is funding to expand the senior nutrition program so that service providers can better meet the needs of hungry older adults. And both of these programs are provided by Jewish and non-Jewish social service agencies. And were championed, as I mentioned, by other non-Jewish organizations as well, and we were offering a support position. Unfortunately, those items went unfunded so far, but we're going to continue to advocate for those. Now, of the 9 items that were really championed by JPAC and our member organizations, we had a lot of success. 7 of them have already been funded in the budget, totaling $141.2 million. And for context, our historic record high has been $76 million. So we almost doubled our record amount of budget funding for this year. Those 7 items include $50 million for community security grants for synagogues and other institutions at risk of hate-motivated violence. That's a request that JPAC champions every single year, and this matches the record amount of funding for this program. We got $40 million to rebuild 6 Jewish and non-Jewish summer camps that were recently lost in wildfires, and that was a partnership with the LA Jewish Federation and Impacted Camps. $36 million to provide home health care and food services to aging Holocaust survivors, and that's administered by many of our wonderful Jewish family service agencies. We got money, $9 million for the construction of a housing projects for adults with disabilities, being developed in part by an offshoot of our JPAC member organization, EDA, an amazing organization. $3 million to renovate and enhance the JFCS Holocaust Center in San Francisco, they are also a JPAC member org and a leading Holocaust education provider in Northern California. And then we also got a couple $1 million to fund the Commission on the State of Hate and the Governor's Council on Holocaust and Genocide Education, which are 2 new state organizations that were created by bills that we've supported in years past. So I'll put into the chat a link that will take you to all of our successful budget items this year. And I just want to name that there are 2 more items that we are still actively working on. 7 of the 9 have been funded. We still want to work to get funding for an interest-free loan program for low-income, food insecure, and homeless students that's being run by an incredible JPAC member organization, Jewish Free Loan Association, and funding for another one of our amazing organizations, JVS, which would provide job training to address inequality and the changing workforce needs. And so as we mentioned, we've passed, the governors may revise the legislature's counterproposal and the final negotiations, and we have a final budget. But there still is the process where we can add trailer bills and potentially amend the budget. And so we're hoping, and we'll continue to push for these items to be included in trailer bill items.
Okay, I think that's a perfect segue, David. Thank you so much, David and Cliff. That was fantastic. I think you both did a great job of illustrating the legislative process in general, and also why JPAC is so impactful. We've gotten countless incredible questions, and I'd really like to get to them. So if you don't mind, I'm going to segue into the Q&A portion of our town hall. Okay, thank you. So we may not be able to get to all of these questions. A lot of them are great. I strongly encourage you, if we don't answer your question today, please send any of us an email, especially me, Sarah at jpac-cal.org. I'll put it in the chat before we leave today. We will get you answers, but I've done my best to select a few that we could address right now. So the one we're going to start with, we got a great question. Why were JPAC specific budget items more successful this year than items with broader coalitions?
That's a great question. Cliff, do you want me to try to take that one first?
Feel free, David.
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, as Cliff mentioned, this is an opaque process, so we have no idea why certain things were or weren't included. But I will say that when we focus on an item, because they're coming from the Jewish community lens and from JPAC, we're able to really hone in on specific champions that we think would be impactful. We found for every one of our successful budget items this year, we found key legislative or Jewish caucus champions. And we've been able to really push them to leverage their social and political capital to be able to get these items in the budget. I think that the two items that went unfunded, they've got a really broad base of support. And what that also leads to sometimes is a diffused kind of sense of urgency for a specific item. There was, the item about extended case management, for example, so important. We've got a lot of organizations that are working heavily on that. And we also have a lot of non-Jewish refugee and asylum seeker organizations that are doing that. And they have a lot of other priorities as well. And so my sense is that when we're able to focus in on a specific item and label its importance to our community in a very targeted way, we've been able to have a tremendous success. And I with so many different priority items this year for some of the other our coalition partners, I don't know that all of these items got the same amount of attention. Is there anything to add?
Yeah, I would just, David, I mean, I think that's all totally accurate and true. I mean, there are a couple of structural things also. I mean, some of those programs, I know many of you know, Governor, not real thrilled with anything that has ongoing out-year fiscal costs, programmatic. Generally speaking, this year, Governor favored and the legislature was looking for capital outlay, one-time only expenditures. So that always weighs in. If the social services program, then quite often, there may be multiple like senior asks or for a variety of senior programs, right. Or immigration, which are competing against each other. Whereas JPAC is able to focus in on Jewish community priorities. Right.
And to hone in on your point, when you say the governor likes one-time structural capital outlay, what you're really saying there is the governor doesn't want to be strongholded into having to make that allocation again next year, right? He wants you to be able to say, I'm going to give you your money now, and I won't need to give it to you again in the future. And that so he can make it seem like that he's funding our programs, but isn't beholden to spending more money in the future on the same things.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much for explaining that. Another great question. Can you explain what are junior and trailer bills?
Yeah, Cliff.
So, yeah, sure. In essence, I mean, it sort of goes back to what I talked about earlier when the legislature started saying, this is the budget bill. This is the budget bill because we want to get it passed by June 15th because we have to get the budget bill passed, but we don't have all the details worked out. Trailer bills, in essence, become bills, traditionally have been focused on particular policy areas. So you have a social services trailer bill, a health trailer bill, a housing trailer bill, a homeless trailer bill. And trailer bills traditionally have enacted, in essence, the statutory changes needed to establish new programs or change existing programs in those subject areas. The budget junior bills tend to be really changes to the budget bill that have been agreed upon between the governor and the legislature. So you will see in like the budget junior bills, sometimes some strikeouts of things that the legislature put in their legislative plan, which the governor basically said, no, we don't want to do that, or new things. So, I mean, a good example this year was, they struck out a number of expenditures in certain areas, particularly, unfortunately, in senior areas. But then they added reproductive rights, completely new, was not in the legislature's plan, but in essence was galvanized by Roe v. Wade and the desire by the leadership and the governor to address the reproductive rights issues. So, and a budget junior bill suddenly appeared over $200 million for various new programs that were not in the legislature's original budget. So those budget junior bills reflect the agreement between the governor and the legislature, and therefore change the legislature's budget.
Yeah, it's a workaround, right? We can get the budget bill in by the deadlines, and then it's a way to extend negotiations beyond it. And for our purposes, it's a way, as we mentioned, we've got 7 items in the budget already, but it's a way for us to continue to advocate for the items that have not yet been funded by the budget.
Exactly. Another round, another bite at the apple.
Right. And even though we're already in the fiscal year, the next fiscal year, it can amend it, until the session ends. Just really quickly, by the way, since we didn't talk about that, the budget bill was passed at the end of June, signed by the governor on the last night of the fiscal year, and then the legislators went off to recess. So right now, for the month of July, legislators are in their districts, they're traveling, they're doing work that's not in the Capitol, and they come back in August to finalize all of the bills that are left to be voted on. And then the session ends at the end of August.
David, I think that's a great segue into our next question. You mentioned that the budget bill was passed. Can you please explain, or Cliff, whoever wants this one, what is different about the bill process and the budget process?
You want me to start, Cliff? And then
feel free.
So Cliff gave a very detailed overview of the budget process, and some of its opacity. And he talked a little bit about the bill process too, and how it's become a little bit more of a closed door process. But at least the bill process is actually very clear in its structure and form. There is, the session every year. We have our session. It begins. Well, really, there's a chance to introduce bills in December, but then all of the legislators come back in January to start meeting. And for the first month-ish of the session, they're coming up with bills. And there is a very clear bill introduction deadline, which is usually mid-February. So every legislator has to introduce a bill by all of their total number of bills for that year. Some of the bills are very full. They are complete with details, and others have one line that just say, this will be a bill about older adults. And we call those spot bills. And then over the next couple of weeks, there's an opportunity for those legislators to insert language, to amend the bills, to insert language that will ultimately be what the bill is. That bill then goes through a process that has very clear guidelines. There's a certain deadline it has to be passed through certain policy committees. There is a certain deadline it has to be passed through. If it has any fiscal impact, it has to go through the Appropriations Committee. And once it makes it through all of those committees, it will go to the floor of the House of Origin. So if it's an assembly member who introduces the bill, it has to be passed by the assembly by a certain date. If it's a senator who introduced the bill, it has to be passed by a Senate by the Senate floor by a certain date. Then it switches houses and goes through the same process: policy committees, fiscal committees, and then the floor. If there was a change in the language of the bill between when it passed off the first house and the second house, it goes back to the first house to be reapproved, and then it goes to the governor's desk to either be signed or vetoed. And there are very clear, as I mentioned, deadlines to get to each of those points. And there are public committee hearings where people can testify. Now, where we are in the process now is that we have passed basically 3/4 of the process. Every bill has been introduced, passed the first committee, passed the first fiscal committee, passed the first floor, and has been passed to the other house. And any bill that's still alive has already passed the policy committee in the second house. So when we come back in August, there are 2 final hurdles that bills have to overcome: the final fiscal committee and the final floor vote, and then they go back for concurrence in the governor's signature. And that all has to happen by August 31st. And the governor will then have a month to sign bills. He'll have the month of September to be able to sign bills.
Great, thank you so much. So we've talked a lot about process, and we have some other questions that are a bit more specific about our items themselves. If you don't mind, I'll segue over to a question about AB 587, which is Assemblymember Gabriel's bill that mandates social media companies alter their terms of service to increase transparency on how hate speech proliferates on their platforms. We have a question about that bill. What reasons for pushback are we seeing, and why?
Complicated issue because it involves both constitutional free speech issues and potential conflict with federal law that in essence creates a degree of safe harbor for these online platforms like social media companies regarding their responsibility for the content of their users, which is a very complex legal area. But I mean, industry pushes back specifically on this proposal because they believe that the requirements of the information to be conveyed in the quarterly reports to the Attorney General's office are too detailed and too onerous. And so there's some very specific objections regarding the reporting requirements. And then broadly speaking, there's a lot of pushback because companies like Facebook, Snapchat, they all operate on a national and international stage, and their basic real concern is that they don't want to have 50 different rules in 50 different states about how they deal with these public policy issues. So they're very concerned about having the state of California pass a bill and then New York pass something with conflicting requirements. I mean, those are a few. I don't know, David, have you heard any others?
Yep.
Okay.
A few of these.
Cliff, I think this one could be for you too, although of course you both could speak on it. How aware or receptive are non-Jewish legislators in districts with few Jews of the rise in anti-Semitism and hate crimes across the state?
I think it's difficult to generalize, but I mean, broadly speaking, we have found a great degree of receptivity to our concerns about those issues. But I would point out that, JPAC is not just focused on anti-Semitism, but in the broader sense of hate crimes and hate activity directed at a variety of ethnic and other communities, whether they be API or whether they be African Americans or Latinos. And so, I do think there's work to be done in educating those communities, but there's also opportunity for common ground, and that our communities, are all the victims of these same kinds of problems. So it's an important conversation to have. I know our Jewish caucus members reach out on a regular basis to their colleagues in the API, Latino, LGBT caucuses. And I think, it's important for our organizations to do that, and for JPAC to do that in Sacramento and our organizations at the local level, because hate is generally not just limited to just anti-Semitism, and certainly affects many different communities.
If I can expand on that question ever so slightly, one of the things, we've found amazing partners in the legislature, and everyone who we talk to has been incredibly receptive and supportive, and that's why we've been able to be so successful with our bills and our budget items. But I will just say that what I found, which is both shocking and not shocking if you think about it, is that a lot of non-Jewish legislators aren't always so aware of Jewish community culture, ritual issues, etc. And coming from someone from myself, who's so deeply embedded in the Jewish world, I sometimes find that shocking amongst our state's leaders. But if you think about it, also Jewish communities in general are historically pretty we co-locate, and so the major Jewish hubs exist in only a subset of the state of California, and by default, our legislature is made up of people who are from all over the state. We can't have two legislators from the same area. So there are a lot of legislators in Sacramento who have very few Jews in their district. And definitely many who, if they have Jews, they're not very organized. And so it really is incumbent upon us to do a lot of work to educate people about the issues of importance to our community, and not assume that they know those things. And we do a lot of that work. So a lot of our lobbying efforts at Advocacy Day and beyond involve us reaching out to elected officials, even when we may not be in their district themselves. And that is really where and how we build power, because if we were only to lobby people that were representing us, we would have a small subset of the legislature. So we're doing a lot of that work, and we also have a lot of work to do, but it's really important to remember.
Yeah, David and had a number of conversations about that, which is, gee, we want to do a lobby day. Everybody wants to go see their legislator, but going to see Henry Stern to convince him to deal with anti-Semitism may not be, where we need to go. It may be Brian Dolly up in,
Right. Exactly.
Whatever the county at Oroville. So, that's one of the definitely one of the challenges that David's talking about, that we need to, continue to educate. It's not that they're not receptive, but it's like they don't know and they're not aware.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly.
So on that note, how worried should we be about Holocaust education and ethnic studies in California? What's the latest update?
Well,
in 5 seconds.
Yeah, that's its own panel in itself.
Yeah. In 5 seconds, those are priority issues, have been priority issues. We are very concerned, our member organizations and JPAC have worked closely together to deal with both of those issues in the legislative Sacramento fronts and in the local community. Holocaust education clearly, and our member organizations like ADL and others that have helped us document the lack of education and awareness present huge challenges, as well as in the liberated ethnic studies movement, trying to continue to push their agenda at the local school level. Now that JPAC was successful at the state level, at least in addressing the model curriculum, the state model curriculum. So now they're running around the state, trying to get around the state model curriculum. David, you want to jump in?
I'll just say we've been making tremendous strides on both of these issues as a community. Ethnic studies was a 2 to 3 year state battle that ended at a place that I think a lot of us are comfortable with. Now, the actual fight around ethnic studies is not done. It just got moved to the local level. But if our past advocacy is any indication, we're set up to effectively fight, and we're going to keep relying on all of our partners to help push to make sure that our ethnic studies curriculum is not one that turns around and discriminates against Jews. So we're doing the work. I wouldn't be concerned, but I would be open-eyed and in communication with us, and I'm happy to talk with anyone about that. And on Holocaust education, we're building momentum around expanding that work. We have to continue to increase the Holocaust education that we have in schools, and we have amazing partners in the Bay Area and LA who are really working with us to make that happen. We've got the new Council on Holocaust and Genocide Education. We've got now funding going towards it. So we're doing a lot of work on these issues. And again, concern, I wouldn't say concern, but attention to is definitely needed.
Okay, great. I'm going to try to squeeze in 1 or 2 more questions, and then we'll be closing up around by 1 o'clock. Okay, so I'm going to go with, there are so many great options. We've gotten a lot of specific questions about unique districts. Can you speak on that? Where should people go to find out more information that's affecting their district?
I assume this is about budget items. Is that
bill items, budget items, like people want to know what's going on at the state level that's going to impact their unique district directly.
Yeah.
Do you have a suggestion for where they should go to?
Yeah. So as Cliff mentioned, every legislator has the opportunity, and I've talked about it a little bit too, but every legislator has the opportunity to submit budget requests that will directly impact specific projects that are important to them. We try to use that process to try to get our items into individual legislators' priority lists. But they're also thinking every legislator wants to be able to bring something very tangible home to their community, whether it's a community center or a bridge or there are oftentimes very specific capital infrastructure projects that they're touting and supporting. That's not our expertise. We know what we're working on, but I would recommend, if you're interested in knowing what's happening in your district, calling your legislator's office. You can find out who your legislator is if you don't know online. There's a website called, I think, findyourrep.legislature.ca.gov. And then you can call the office directly and say, hey, I want to know what budget items you made, budget requests you made this year and how successful they were. You can also peruse their website and see if they have any press releases about it or see if there's any media on it. We can share a lot more about the items that we supported, some of them are very tangible in locations. For example, and Cornerstone Housing is putting together their housing for adults with disabilities in the Pico Robertson neighborhood. JFCS Holocaust Center is helping to expand their infrastructure in San Francisco. So those are some tangible things that we are working on. But anything beyond those items, I would recommend contacting your legislator directly.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, David. I'm going to squeeze one last question in here, which I think is an interesting one. How would a potential recession impact JPAC's strategy for 2023 and 2024, if at all?
Well, a recession certainly may have an impact on the state budget, which may be, if unfortunately, if there's no money to spend, if there's no discretionary money to spend, depending on how severe the recession is, what his impact is on the state budget. It's what I mentioned earlier. Some years we've had to flip from asking for new money to like protecting like programs for seniors like MSSP, right, or CBAS, or other kinds of social services programs that can be on the chopping block. Unfortunately, for a large part of Arnold Schwarzenegger's tenure as governor, we were focused on protecting programs and protecting various Jewish constituencies versus the opportunity to expand. So right, that is something of immediate concern.
I would say, just as a quick answer, I would say that this is a really great question, and it taps into the big challenge of my job, which is we want to celebrate the amazing work that we did this year, record amounts of funding. We also at the same time need to set expectations that this was in part because of, I think, tremendous advocacy efforts and relationship building, and also in part because of a big budget surplus. And so success next year might not look like $141 million from the state budget. It might look like something very different. Our work will increase the amount of available budget money that we can access or protect against losing. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we can compare it from year to year and say that this shows that we've done better or worse every single year. We're largely impacted by the state budget. So as Cliff, just to be very tangible on what Cliff said, in 2021, JPAC and the Jewish Caucus, where I was working at the time, were successful in getting a record amount of funding to the nonprofit security grant program. We got, in 2019, we got $15 million. I think sevenfold more than we'd ever gotten before. And in 2020, we asked for an even greater amount, and then COVID hit and the budget got absolutely slashed and we got nothing. But instead we turned our focus to trying to ensure that $120 million of funding towards senior services was not cut. It was originally proposed as being cut, and we were successfully able to stop it from being cut. So we got nothing in security grants that year, but we saved a $120 million program. How do you quantify that? It's hard to tell, but the more impact that we have, the more influence and the better relationships that we have, the better we'll be able to do given the current context. And so we'll continue to fight for as much as we can get every single year, but we never really know. We're kind of at the whim of the budget as well.
Well, thank you so much, David and Cliff, for the valuable information that you shared. Thank you, Allison, who posted a lot of links in the chat. I hope everybody gets a chance to check them out. And thank you to our audience for joining us today. And again, please email us if you have any questions at all. Our emails are in the chat, and go to our website and our Twitter for updates on the legislative process.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thanks, Cliff. Thanks, Allison.
Thank you both so much. Thanks, everybody.
Have a great day, everyone.